Welcome to this episode of Season 6 of The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has reached over 5 million listeners, viewers, and readers around the world. With our surging growth in audience and subscriptions, The Common Bridge continues to expand its reach. The show is available on the Substack website and the Substack app. Simply search for The Common Bridge. You can also find us on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Common Bridge draws guests and audiences from around the political spectrum, and we invite you to become a free or paid subscriber on your favorite medium.
Hello, welcome to The Common Bridge. I'm your host, Rich Helppie, and today we've got a returning guest from Eastern Michigan University, Professor Jesse Kaufman. He is an expert on Eastern and Central Europe, author of books, in fact, another one coming out. You'll remember Professor Kaufman from 3 years ago, in April of 2022, not long after Russia had invaded Ukraine. We talked a lot about the history of the region, the various ethnicities there, insight that I didn't know, for example, that the mother tongue of President Zelensky is Russian, and the complexities of this. And now here we are, not on episode 148 any longer, but now in our 6th season of The Common Bridge, and we're going to revisit Ukraine, Europe, and related matters. And so, our Dr. Jesse Kaufman, welcome back to The Common Bridge. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thanks for having me back.
I can't imagine how busy you have been with all the events, and I trust that the students are curious about the context and what happened. You've got to ask you this: how surprised are you 3 years later about what's transpired in Ukraine?
Surprised? I mean, having spent a little time there before the war, I'm not really surprised at all. I thought the Russians were going to have a very tough fight on their hands, much tougher than they thought. And, I think I was right. I think they believe their own propaganda, and, but anybody who'd been there and talked to the people, this was not going to go the way they thought. And so, I'm very impressed that they've really held out.
They have at great cost. As the Common Bridge, we're trying to find where people can agree, and I used to think it would be easy to get people to agree, like, let's not have a war and kill people and destroy things. That's more difficult than I thought. My understanding is that the Russians now have control of 18-19% of Ukraine territory, including many key ports, and are things at a standstill today on the ground?
It does seem that way. I think it probably is at a stalemate. I think that if it were just a matter of real estate, Ukraine would probably be willing to deal, but it's not that. It's not what they're fighting for. It's not what the Russians want. So, 18-19% is not enough. It has to be 100%.
Well, when you think about what is it that the Russians want, and, early on, there was a lot of talk about they want to put the band back together. Let's get the USSR together. That's their buffer zone. Of course, they've been invaded multiple times in their history, including, devastating losses in World War II. In the early 1990s, Gorbachev agreed to allow the reunification of Germany. And there was a memo from James Baker that said NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward from that early 1990s meeting. Yet, since that time, there's been 16 countries that have joined NATO. And I can only imagine how the Russians would look at that. I mean, if, China had set up a defense pact with Canada and they were there on the Montana border, I'd probably be a little concerned about that. But is there a way to help our listeners, readers, and viewers understand that maybe what Russia's feeling and what they're after?
Yeah. So first of all, I really don't think it has anything to do with NATO. Ukraine did not become interested in NATO until after Russia annexed Crimea. And of course, one hears about, we have to see NATO from their perspective, but you also have to see it from the states that asked to join: Estonia, Latvia, Poland, places like that. Essentially, what they see it is arson insurance. And, they're being told, well, you can't buy arson insurance because you might tempt the guy next door to burn your house down. So it's better not to have that insurance. So they see it as defensive. The line in the memo was never a promise, was not a condition. And what was much more explicit was that us and Russia agreed to respect Ukraine's borders if they gave up their nukes, which they did. And Russia has reneged, and now we have reneged. So the existential threat to Ukraine from Russia is much more pressing, and has been much more pressing than any, I think, frankly, imaginary threat that NATO might pose to Russia. There's, I think its neighbors have more reason to be scared of Russia than Russia has to be scared of, say, Lithuania.
Indeed. And I think since we talked last time, I had been up to Finland and in Lapland, and I went looking for people that didn't like the idea of Finland joining NATO. I found exactly zero.
Yeah, that's right.
They have a saying, and this doesn't translate 100%, but it effectively, the enemy may be coming from the West because they may have flanked you, but they know that the enemy is to the east, and they feel much better about being part of NATO, especially as you get into that high north. They've got the highways widened to land like our fighter jets there and such.
Right.
So they're feeling pretty good about that.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, and I can't speak for the whole country, obviously, but I went looking, couldn't find anybody that didn't like that idea. When we talked last time, you were working on a book, and you had to return to Europe to finish that. And I want to remind our readers and listeners and our viewers that you're well versed in this region of the world. You speak Polish. You've taught classes. I don't know if it's part of your current class load about the history of warfare. And you're also considered an expert in this part of the world. Just, if you wouldn't mind, please bring us up to date on, were you able to get over there? What did you see? And how's the book coming?
So I was able to get over there. And it was very interesting because I was in Poland. There were a lot of Ukrainian refugees there, but exclusively women and children. And it was interesting because I was also in Europe when was it, like 2006 or something, when there's big waves of like Syrian, I think, refugees, which were almost exclusively men or young men. You tended to see young men around. So it was very different to see this wave of refugees. It was exclusively women and children, occasionally a kind of elderly man or something, but you could, the men were all there fighting. So, and, Poland, like you said, the reaction you got in Finland was sort of surprising. So I had a friend in Poland who I think considers herself very progressive and, anti-war, but she held me personally responsible. So why isn't the U.S. attacking Russia now? Because, Poland's next. Let's just get this done. So I'm like, well, hold on, they're all convinced. I mean, they were issuing iodine for radiation in Krakow when I was there, just in case. So, things were tense. I think they've relaxed a bit now. You asked me if I was surprised. I am surprised at how inept the Russian army has been. I'm surprised they're still fighting, honestly. I have a friend who has taught at West Point. He's fought in all the wars. And when this first started, he was watching footage of the Russians. And he's saying, this is like they're violating basic, very, very basic rules of infantry maneuver. They have no idea what they're doing. So I'm a bit surprised about that. Anyways, yeah, the book's good. It should be out next summer. It's called Blood Dim Tide, Central Europe's Long Great War, 1905 to 1921. And the Ukraine War is definitely part of that because the first Russian invasion of Ukraine comes in December 1917 when Ukraine declares its autonomy from Russia for the first time. And in many ways, that's why it has nothing to do with NATO. That has been going on ever since.
Yeah, they declared sovereignty. And again, I would recommend everyone go back to the episode 148. There's a podcast and a transcript out there. It's a great history lesson. It brings things into context. But it remains a mystery, I think, that why now? Why, Russia seized the Crimea in 2014. They went quiet briefly. And then they invaded into Ukraine sovereign territory again, and I think it was called a special military operation. They wanted to denationalize or denazify Ukraine. I don't know how hard that would be to get the Nazis out of Ukraine. Are they there? What is it that they're after?
So I don't know if we talked about it last time, but there's a couple things going on. One is that Ukraine was very much on the verge. So let me put it this way. Let me back up. So if you look at the trajectory of post-Soviet states, right? On the one hand, you have a place like Poland, which is thriving, rule of law, democracy, robust institutions, happy to be independent, celebrating its own culture, its own history. And then you have Belarusia, which has essentially been denationalized, is economically decrepit, it's corrupt, and it's under the thumb of Putin. So Ukraine was unambiguously on the Polish route. It was becoming more prosperous. Yes, it still has some corruption, as all of these post-Soviet states do, but it was democratic. The rule of law is becoming ever more entrenched. It was thriving. And I think part of the reason he invaded is that, no other way to put it, it makes him look bad, right? So Russia is becoming more autocratic while this, what they see is not even a real country, is doing exceptionally well. And the other part is, I think we maybe talked about it last time, is that many Russians genuinely, truly believe there is no such thing as a Ukrainian. They are Russians. They speak a dialect of Russian to them. And all that's happened is that the West has come in and created this nonsensical identity called Ukrainian and used it to undermine Russia. So they see it as a threat to their current system, but they also see it as a kind of existential threat to their identity. And that's part of why it went so badly for them, because you can read some of the intelligence reports from the early weeks of the war. They clearly actually believe this. Hitler thought that the USSR was not a real country, is kept in place basically by terror and slavery. So he thought, well, the Wehrmacht just kicks down the door, the whole house will collapse. And it's exactly the way the Russians were thinking about Ukraine. It's not a real state. It's kept alive by this kind of NATO scheming and so on. We'll kick in the door. Everybody will be happy to see us. And, that's not what happened.
Yeah, that's interesting. They thought they would be welcomed as liberators, and instead they find themselves in a devastating, bloody war. I find it really interesting that the ineptitude of the Russian military, there's been reports that they have just been sending conscripts to the front lines with little to no training. And now they're adding North Koreans and allegedly Chinese as well. Right. And that the North Koreans are being told, don't surrender because we'll kill your family in North Korea. So it's even if you believe, let's say, in the strategic objectives, tactically, how can they be that bad?
I know. Yeah, I don't know. It's, I think it probably has something to do with its authoritarian systems that, nobody wants to tell the chief the army's not ready. So, you just lie and everybody lies on all the reports and all of this. So I don't know, but it's definitely something systemic. And, I don't know how to explain that.
So if we look to how this might end, and there's a lot of factors going on right now. So by way of example, many countries in the European Union are saying they're going to step up their defense spending. They're going to commit more resources. They're going to show that they're going to stand up to Russia. We've got that factor going on. And then we talk about democratic principles, but my understanding is that the elections in Ukraine, at least for president, have been suspended. What other factors are going into making it easier or more difficult to get a resolution to stop the killing over in Ukraine?
So, I mean, I think part of it is what Zelensky said at the White House, and he was right. We've signed all of these things with the Russians over and over again, and it doesn't mean anything to them. Traditional diplomats see a treaty as binding, but they do not. And again, I would say kind of like Hitler. Hitler signed all kinds of treaties, including a non-aggression pact with Poland, and then later the USSR. They were just means to an end, and the end is not peace or stability. So as far as the European buildup, I mean, that's one thing where I've agreed with the current administration on for a long time, that it's time for the rest of NATO to step up. I'm just not sure it's going to happen. They've been so thoroughly civilianized, and this is just... I don't know. I'll believe it when I see it. I think more realistically, what you might see is that they will maybe invest in a nuclear arsenal because it's much cheaper. And, you don't have to deal with conscripts and all that sort of thing. And you don't have to feed them or put their kids through college. And, I think that the lesson probably people will take from Ukraine is don't ever give up your nukes. If you have nukes, you're probably not going to be invaded. If you don't, you're vulnerable. So we'll see.
And I was just reading this morning about a new type of drone that Sweden has developed that is AI driven, that they can change its mission. It learns. And who knows, maybe we're going to be in a drone manufacturing contest.
Absolutely.
It's all pretty pointless to me if we keep destroying things. The president of the United States, President Donald Trump, proposed that there would be a mineral rights agreement struck between the United States, or I don't know if it was the United States and on behalf of NATO and Ukraine. And they thought that that would then basically be the pretext to say that the United States has vital interests in Ukraine short of NATO, and that therefore Russia can be told to back off because you're now threatening United States vital interests. First of all, I don't know if I've got that right.
You do.
Okay. And then are there valuable minerals in Ukraine? I guess because I think that's a question too, is it not?
It's I think there are valuable minerals there. Ukraine's always been as a source of all kinds of raw materials, coveted by various powers, the Nazis, the Soviets, and so on. I'm not convinced by that security arrangement because normally when the U.S. has business interests somewhere and a war starts, you just evacuate the businessmen. It's not a tripwire. Only military forces can function as a tripwire, which is in a way what NATO is for. So if it is going to be a tripwire, well, why not just have it be a real tripwire? So, yeah.
And that brings us to the brink of war. If you're Putin and you see NATO deploying into Ukraine, you can't beat them conventionally. You have to be first strike ready if you're going to do that.
Right.
Now, and early on in the war, we were told that the Russians had hypersonic missiles and that we had no defense for. And, I haven't heard about that. Now, it doesn't mean they're not being used. I just haven't heard about it. Do we know what's going on with their hypersonic missiles?
I don't think so. I mean, you heard about one or two supposedly that hit their targets and then that kind of disappeared. So, the last chatter I saw was that they hadn't worked right. And, so they were sort of quietly put away. But that's a good question. And, there's a lot, even the best news sources and open source intelligence, it's just very murky, because of the nature of both governments, because of the war, all these sort of things. It's really hard to get really first rate information. So, that's a good question. I don't know.
I wonder if you watched any of the exchange with the president, the vice president, Vice President Vance, President Trump, with President Zelensky, and what your take is on all of that? I know it was really hard for me to sort out. Something happened before that, something happened afterwards, and I watched that, and I'm just cocked my head because I just didn't understand it. What was going on there?
I think a whole lot of things were going on there. So I think people say you have to watch the whole thing. Okay, but you have to really watch the whole thing, which is in the weeks before, Trump was tweeting things like Ukraine shouldn't have started this war, right? Zelensky is a dictator. So there's no sense he's being slandered on the world stage before he even sets foot in there. So he's expecting a not pleasant environment. And then if Jonah Goldberg's correct, somebody I follow, it was supposed to be a 5-minute photo op. And you have your photo and then you go in and you talk. It turned into a 40-minute Q&A with various handpicked reporters, which was not supposed to happen, and I think caught him off guard. And the way I read it, it's a guy. So here's the thing: some people on what used to be my side of the thing don't understand. Zelensky's a dead man. Zelensky is going to have a target on his back for the rest of his life, no matter what happens. Even if, say, Ukraine somehow wins and ejects the Russians, the FSB, he's at the top of the FSB's list for the rest of his life. And he knows that. And so to me, the telling exchange was when he said, and he was mocked for this, he didn't understand the language. He said, "I'm not playing cards." I thought that was great. It's like, I've been at the bedside of these dying soldiers and these funerals. And I'm a dead man. If the FSB ever gets hold of me, I'm not playing cards. Let's be serious about this.
The FSB, for the part of our audience that don't understand the acronym.
Oh, it's the Russian Security Services, basically. Yep. Yeah. The guys they killed that guy or tried to kill that guy in Great Britain. They poisoned him.
There's a lot of people around Putin that thought they could fly out of very tall buildings, and It turned out that none of them could.
None of them could.
And Zelensky, I'm sure, has connecting the dots. Now, another take that I've read about, and again, I have no background to get the veracity of this, but that the meeting in the White House was supposed to be about signing that mineral rights agreement, and that it was supposed to be the 5-minute sign it, shake hands, and that's it. And then Zelensky refused to sign it. Is there any veracity at all to that?
There could be. Again, the account I read that goes back before that, which again, I don't know if this is true. When he was presented with it in Ukraine before he left by the U.S. representative, he told them, it contains security guarantees, right? So he and his people read it, and there are no security guarantees. He says, where are they? And the answer is, they're implicit because we'll have this business relationship, and therefore that's a security guarantee. And he says, that's not what we talked about. Yeah. And an implicit guarantee isn't worth the paper it's printed on, which I think he's right. I mean, so it was interesting how that whole scene was like a Rorschach test, right? Everybody watched the same thing and came away with completely different views of what happened. So,
you talked about whether the Ukrainians could eject the Russians, and is this war winnable militarily by either side? And I know that's it's a crystal ball moment, but I don't know if you've thought about it. These Ukraine could win if they did this, and Russia could win if they did that. And what would a victory look like?
It's a great question. I mean, I think in a way the Ukrainians already have won, in a sense that they preserved their independence. And I think that at this point, the Russians are somewhat unlikely to overrun the rest of the country. And if they did, that's the thing, the next 50, 100 years in Ukraine would make the West Bank look like, Duluth, Minnesota or something. I mean, they would never be able to solidify their rule on that place. There would be underground resistance, all sorts of things. So what I was hoping for, and I was hoping the administration would pressure the Ukrainians a bit, was, look, the Russians can keep what they've taken so far, but we are going to guarantee they come no farther. And to me, there is no other way out of this war than that. The problem is, and again, Zelensky is being dragged over the coals for a deal, not taking a deal that was never offered. This was never about real estate for the Russians, ever. So we need to find a way to make it about real estate for them and say, you know what, it's time you cut your losses, right? You've destroyed your army. Nobody respects you as a military power anymore. You've been humiliated, frankly, by the Ukrainians. Cut your losses, draw the lines here. You know, yes, there will be people in Ukraine be very upset. I understand that, but that territory is all blasted now anyway. It's worthless. Let them have their consolation prize. NATO will come in and say the Russians will not come through here anymore. I don't see any other way of settling it.
So basically saying, okay, what Russia has destroyed and now controls, they get to keep that. Ukraine gets a NATO guarantee that if they go further, that they'll be contending with NATO, and that it would be then left with whatever guerrilla action that would be taking place in the conquered territory. And
Right, which would probably dissipate itself eventually. I don't think it could be a NATO guarantee because we guaranteed the borders that they overran now. It would have to be a real tripwire. NATO formations there.
And I thought that was interesting what you said about the European states, not really having a military culture anymore, but more civilian. The answer can't be we're going to send young Americans over there, and the answer can't be we're going to send American treasure over there. At some point, if they perceive a threat, don't the European countries, particularly those in the European Union, don't they have to step up and make their own security guarantees with Ukraine?
They do. And I think we should, our military will have to be part of it. There's no way out of that right now, I think. But we should help them step up. And it doesn't even have to be major. Again, what are the reasons why U.S. aircraft carriers maneuver off Taiwan? It's a tripwire, right? It's to get in the way and trigger a larger response. So you wouldn't need more than, I don't know, you could send a battalion of German soldiers there, a battalion or a regiment of French. It doesn't have to be a lot. It just has to be there. There was a terrible video making the rounds, captured on a GoPro, Ukrainian soldier and a Russian soldier, hand-to-hand combat with knives. I don't know if you saw this. Yeah, it was bad. It was really bad. But the thing that really struck me is, you can spend all the money you want, but what it comes down to is having people that are willing and able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't see, Jens from West Berlin, trying to stab somebody in a trench in East Ukraine. I just don't see it.
Absolutely. And in the history of warfare, it always comes down to boots on the ground or sandals on the ground if you go back far enough. But if you look at what we did to Vietnam, the amount of ordnance we dropped on that country, and it just makes people angry. It's right. All you really achieve. Yeah. So we're looking at a war that's probably not winnable in any conventional sense, that Ukraine under that scenario would have to say, all right, we're going to cede part of our territory to stop the war and trust that it's not going to start again. Russia and Putin would have to say, oh yeah, that was our objective. We're good, and go to the side. When we talked a long time ago, 3 years ago, and you were speculating that perhaps this war could only end with a regime change in Kiev or in Moscow. And both of those scenarios seem to be plausible at the time. What's your view on it today? Is that still within the realm of possibility?
It's not looking like it in either case, my big question with the Ukraine war is, I wonder if it were to grind on, I really wonder if it would survive Putin. Like, he is now so personally invested in it, right? But if someone were to succeed him that has, I don't know, greater sense of self-preservation or something and found a way out, to me, that's probably the best hope. but that or the collapse of the Russian army.
Well, let me ask you a difficult question, if I might, Professor Kaufman.
Sure.
And it's going to require your imagination.
Okay.
So imagine you get a call from the White House, and President Trump and Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio want to have a meeting with you.
All right.
Let's presume they really want to listen, including the president. All right. And they say, what's your best advice? What do we do here? And how do we go about doing it? What might you offer to the president?
Wow. That's a tough one. So I think I would tell them, boy, that's really tough, that if Russia does not withdraw back to the pre-war boundaries, then NATO will guarantee the boundaries up to which they've advanced now, and the choice is up to them, right? And I would publicize that this is a choice. The main thing that I would really want them to see is that for Ukraine, this is an existential war. That's what that's why he's not playing cards. That's how they perceive it, and justly so. It's not about real estate. And so once you understand that, then I think you'll be able to be a bit more sensible about the kinds of negotiations you enter into and what's going to be acceptable and what's not. You got to remember, this is literally life and death for them, existence or annihilation. So begin from that principle and go from there. And also stop telegraphing that you expect everything from one side and nothing from the other. That's probably not a good negotiating tactic.
Very good. It's very intractable situation. And, I certainly don't want to have you back in a year or 3 years and talk about this war continuing, or how's Europe doing cleaning up the nuclear aftermath, which would be, a horrible outcome. As you're studying this and teaching your students and publishing, what type of topics are you starting to get interested in diving in deeper, both from a research and a publishing perspective?
Boy. So for the teaching aspect, we've talked a lot about technology and the way it unfolds in ways that maybe seem obvious in retrospect, but never are at the time. I mean, the way drones have been used is very interesting, and this is clearly the future, although exactly how it's going to meld with other kinds of warfighting technologies. I mean, like you said, the end still comes down to boots on the ground, and so drones will be a part of that. In terms of war, I mean, again, it's also very interesting for thinking about nuclear deterrence and, how the purpose of nuclear weapons is to have them so you don't have to use them. But that means maintaining a credible arsenal, right? So I do think something that's restrained Putin up till now from using one is the reality would probably be the last thing he ever did, right? So that would unleash annihilation. And because of our submarines, we still have the upper hand in that thing. We have guaranteed second or even third strike capability, which again, it's horrible to contemplate these things, but you have to, because they're thinking about it too. So, and if you can stay a step ahead, then the purpose is to never have to use them. So, and I also think that it's Americans think they're not ideological, which is wrong. Ideology tends to be like, water for fish. Fish don't believe in water, right? So Americans don't believe in ideology. They definitely are marinating in it. But, I think it's hard for them to understand that when Putin says there's no such thing as a Ukrainian, I mean, you've got to listen to these people. He absolutely means it. They see the world differently from us. So I was just for a talk looking at a map that the Institute for the Study of War put together late January 22 or early February, so weeks before the war. And it showed all the Russian dispositions are all the way encircling Ukraine. And it's remarkable to look back and think everybody looked at that map and said, no, that's not going to happen. I mean, look at it now, you're like, how could so many people have been so wrong?
Yeah, and miscalculations have sent the world into wars, and it's man's folly, humankind's folly. Professor Kaufman, you are a fascinating guest, and I really appreciate your time here. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you'd like to convey to the listeners, readers, and viewers of the Common Bridge?
I think we did cover everything. I mean, and I guess maybe one thing I like to leave them on is that as they sort through what is and isn't driving the Russians, to consider the perspective of places like the Baltic states and Finland and Poland, that, this is a very serious threat to them. And, you can abdicate for withdrawing from NATO all you want, but to them, it's real. It's real. So, maybe bear that in mind.
Yeah, it'd be a worldwide calamity, and we need to bifurcate that about the other countries spending more on their own defense versus a threat that the United States won't be there.
Right.
Any student of history, a mild student of history, would understand the folly of that. And, as our current president said, that we have two oceans protecting us, obviously doesn't understand the difference between the pre-World War II methods of conveyance and what we have today.
Absolutely. And maybe if I could leave him with one last thing, go out and watch a Norwegian Netflix show called Occupied. It was made before the war in Ukraine, actually, but it very plausibly envisions a kind of what I call a soft Russian takeover of Norway. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition because, the Russians project a credible threat. But to the Norwegians, the whole time, the number one priority is, well, we just have to make sure nobody gets hurt. Just do what they want so nobody gets hurt.
Oh, no.
And so it's I think it's actually a good reflection of security culture in a way in Europe. And it's very compelling and interesting. And in that show, the U.S. has left NATO in this alternate future. So, Occupied.
Well, that looks like it's a good watch for sure. And I just contrast that with the Finns. They're like, we'll fight them again.
Yeah,
it's like,
and they'll beat them again.
Yeah, indeed. Ultimately be overpowered, but it was a obviously horrible experience. But they're very proud of that. And of course, every able-bodied man in Finland gets military training. Yep. And it goes on into, you can be in your 50s and you're still getting there. Everybody has a job to do in the event of a war. So, but there's less than 5 million people in Finland, so it's not that big of a military there. Professor, any closing comments? This has been great as always.
Closing comment is just thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
It's our honor and our pleasure. We've been talking today with Professor Jesse Kaufman of Eastern Michigan University. He's been sharing his expertise in history and in warfare and in Europe. Please look him up and look up his books. And if you're in Southeast Michigan, I'd recommend enrolling in his classes. And with our guest, Dr. Jesse Kaufman, this is your host, Rich Helppie, signing off on The Common Bridge.
Thanks for joining us on The Common Bridge. Subscribe to The Common Bridge on Substack.com or use their Substack app, where you can find more interviews, columns, videos, and nonpartisan discussions of the day. Just search for The Common Bridge. You can also find The Common Bridge on Mission Control Radio on your Radio Garden app.